23 cameras, motion sensors on every entrance, a security system worth more than most houses, and still, someone got in. When Ernest Crown checked the footage, every single camera went dark at exactly 11:48 p.m. for 6 minutes. No static, no glitches, total darkness, clean, like someone flipped a switch. When the cameras came back on, his maid was on the kitchen floor, beaten, and beside her hand, a note. Whoever did this didn't break in. They already had access. But the note wasn't a threat against her. It was a threat against him. And the man who sent it gave Ernest exactly 72 hours to make a decision that could destroy his empire or destroy something far worse. What he chose, and what it cost him, is a story you won't be able to stop listening to. Ernest Crown had ordered violence before. He had sanctioned broken bones, approved the kind of conversations that ended with men limping out of warehouses with new understandings of loyalty. He had watched surveillance footage of things that would make a civilian vomit, and he had done it while eating takeout from the Thai place on Pike Street, but never inside his own home. It was past midnight in Seattle. In November, rain lashed the mansion windows in sheets so thick the city lights beyond the iron gate blurred into watercolor. The house sat on a hill in Washington Park, old money architecture wrapped in new money security, cameras at every angle, motion sensors buried in the lawn, a panic room behind the library wall that could withstand a Category 5 hurricane or a federal raid, whichever came first. Ernest stood in the upstairs hallway, still dressed from the evening's business. Charcoal suit, a no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. He was 36 years old, and every year showed, not in wrinkles, but in the careful stillness of a man who had learned that the less he moved, the more power he projected. His face was angular, sharp-boned, with deep brown skin and eyes that catalogued everything and revealed nothing. He had come home from a meeting with port officials, the legitimate kind, the ones who signed import documents for his construction supply company, a Crown Industrial. The company was real. The profits were real. The concrete and steel that built half the waterfront condos in Belltown were real. What sat beneath those legitimate invoices, layered like sediment at the bottom of a river, that was something else entirely. The house was too quiet. He noticed it the way a predator notices a shift in wind. Not consciously at first. It registered in his body before his mind. A tightening behind the ribs, a slight redirection of attention, on the ambient noise of the mansion, the low hum of the HVAC, the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, the occasional creak of old wood settling against the rain, all present. But something was missing. The kitchen light. Lillian always left it on. She had been working in his house for 9 months, and in that time, Ernest had come to know her patterns the way he knew the tide schedules at the port. Unconsciously, through observation rather than study. She rose at 5, though she cleaned the kitchen first. She left the small light above the stove, burning every night, not the overhead fluorescent, but the little amber one that cast a warm glow across the countertops, like a candle in a window. It was dark now. He descended the stairs. His footsteps made no sound on the hardwood, a habit so ingrained it was no longer deliberate. The foyer was empty, the sitting room dark, the hallway that led to the kitchen stretched before him like a held breath. And he pushed the door open. She was on the floor. Not unconscious, worse, she was awake, curled on her side near the base of the island counter, her knees drawn up, one arm wrapped around her midsection. Her uniform, the simple gray dress she wore daily, was torn at the shoulder. Her lip was split, a dark line of dried blood trailing to her chin, and around her throat, vivid against her pale skin, finger-shaped bruises were already blooming purple. She was breathing, shallow, rapid, and the breathing of a woman who had taught herself to be very, very quiet while in pain. Ernest did not move for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, something happened inside him that he would spend the next several weeks trying to understand. It was not rage, though rage came, thick and immediate, flooding his chest like battery acid. It was not shock, though his vision narrowed and his pulse hammered against his temples. It was recognition. He had seen this before, not this woman, not this kitchen, but this exact tableau, a woman on a cold floor, damaged and diminished, breathing like she was trying to become invisible. He had seen it 100 times, 1,000, in photographs, in reports, in the peripheral vision of a younger man who had trained himself not to look directly at certain things. He moved toward her, slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal that might bolt. "Lillian!" Her eyes were open. She flinched at his voice but did not look up. "Lillian, I need you to tell me." Then he saw it, a folded piece of paper, placed beside her open hand on the tile floor, not dropped, placed, deliberately. The fold was precise. It was not hers. He picked it up. One sentence typed on white paper, clean font. "You built the cage she grew up in." The kitchen tilted. Ernest read it again. And again. The words did not change. They sat on the page like a verdict, quiet and absolute. The rain hammered the windows. Lillian's breathing stuttered and caught, and in the silence between her breaths, he could hear something else, the sound of his own past, rising from the place he had buried it, clawing its way up through 12 years of concrete and silence. He folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he knelt beside her. "I'm going to lift you," he said. "I need to get you to a hospital." She shook her head, a tiny movement, but sharp, final. "No hospital," she whispered. Her voice was raw, stripped. "You need no hospital, no police." He had heard those words before, too, from people who had every reason to fear institutions, from people who had been failed by every system designed to protect them. He did not argue. Instead, he lifted her from the floor, carefully, one arm under her knees, one supporting her back, and carried her to the sitting room. She weighed almost nothing. He had carried heavier things without thinking, but her weight felt enormous. It pressed against his chest with a gravity that had nothing to do with physics. He set her on the couch, retrieved a blanket, ice wrapped in a cloth, water. His hands moved through these tasks with the efficient precision of a man accustomed to crisis management, but his mind was elsewhere. "You built the cage she grew up in." He stepped into the hallway and called Marcus, his head of security. The phone rang twice. "I need you at the house. Now." Someone got in. Silence on the other end. And then, "How?" "That's what you're going to tell me." Marcus arrived in 14 minutes. He was a broad, methodical man in his late 40s, former military police, zero tolerance for uncertainty. He had run Ernest's security detail for 8 years, and in that time, the estate had never been breached, until tonight. They stood in the basement's security office, a room that smelled of ozone and coffee. 9 monitors displayed feeds from every angle of the property: the front gate, in the east garden, the garage entrance, the kitchen hallway. Marcus pulled up the timeline, scrubbing backward through the footage. "Here," he pointed, 11:47 p.m. kitchen camera. Normal. Lillian cleaning the counters. The footage showed her moving through her routine. Quiet, practiced. She wiped the marble in long, even strokes. Then she paused, tilted her head, listened. She heard something, Ernest said. "Watch." At 11:48, the footage cut. Every camera in the house went simultaneously dark, not static, dark, clean, as if someone had pressed a switch. 6 minutes, Marcus said. All feeds dead for exactly 6 minutes, 11:48 to 11:54. Then they come back. And when they come back, Marcus scrubbed forward. At 11:54, the cameras resumed. The kitchen was empty except for Lillian on the floor, already in the position Ernest found her. "No one on any feed entering or leaving," Marcus said. His voice was level, but his jaw was tight. "Whoever did this knew our system." Knew the blind spots. Knew the rotation of the cameras. The 6-second overlap gap at the east corridor. This was not a break-in, Ernest. This was an operation. Ernest stared at the frozen image of Lillian on the floor. The note beside her hand. "Staff," he asked. "I'll run everyone. But if someone got through our perimeter without tripping a single sensor, we're not looking at a random intruder. When we're looking at someone with inside access to the security architecture. Or someone I used to work with." Marcus looked at him. There was a question in his eyes, but he did not ask it. Marcus had worked for Ernest long enough to know which doors to leave closed. "Lock the house down," Ernest said. "Full protocol. No one in or out until I say otherwise. In and pull the personnel files on everyone who's been inside these walls in the past 60 days. "What about her?" "She stays." "Ernest." "She stays." Marcus left. Ernest remained in the security room, standing before the monitors like a man at a confessional booth, except the priest was the past and the confession was 12 years overdue. He took the note from his pocket and read it again. "You built the cage she grew up in." He closed his eyes and let the memories come. 12 years ago. He had been 24, young by any measure, but in his world, 24 was old enough to run operations that moved product along the Pacific corridor. Not drugs, not primarily. Ernest's early portfolio had been logistics. Routes, transportation networks that connected ports to warehouses, to distribution centers, all hidden behind the legitimate scaffolding of his father's construction company. His father, Raymond Crown, had built the empire, and Ernest had inherited the infrastructure. And for 3 years, between the ages of 22 and 25, he had managed a network that moved things, and sometimes people, through channels that existed in the spaces between legal oversight. He had never touched anyone. He had never visited the holding locations. He had never looked at the manifests closely enough to understand what the coded entries truly meant. Cargo variations, non-standard freight, supplemental logistics, language designed to obscure, language he had chosen not to decode. He had signed the routes, approved the schedules, ensured the payments cleared, and he had looked away. At 25, he had shut it down. Not out of conscience, not at first. The risk profile had changed. Federal scrutiny on Pacific corridor trafficking had intensified. Several associates had been arrested. Ernest had calculated the exposure, weighed it against profitability, and made a business decision. He had told himself it was also a moral decision, that he had always been uncomfortable, that the shutdown proved he was different from his father, that the 3 years of complicity were an aberration, not a pattern, that he had changed. He had been telling himself that for 12 years. And now there was a woman on his couch with bruises in the shape of fingers around her throat and a note that said otherwise. And she did not sleep. He checked on her at 2 in the morning and found her sitting upright on the couch, the blanket pulled to her chin, staring at the rain-streaked window with a 1,000-yard gaze of someone who was not seeing the present. He brought her tea, set it on the side table, sat in the armchair across from her, far enough that she would not feel enclosed, close enough that she would know she was not alone. This calibration was not something he had learned. It was something he understood instinctively, which bothered him, because it meant he understood something about fear that he should not understand. "I need to ask you questions," he said. She did not respond for a long time. Then, very quietly, "I know. Did you see who did this?" "There were 2 of them. I didn't see their faces. They wore masks, ski masks." She paused. "They weren't here to hurt me. Not really. The beating was measured, professional. They hit me enough to leave marks. Not enough to cause permanent damage. They wanted it to look bad. They wanted you to see it." Ernest absorbed this. Professional, measured, a message delivered through her body. "The note," he said. "They put it there after. One of them placed it next to my hand, carefully, like he was arranging a scene." "Do you know what it means?" Silence. The rain filled the space between them. Lillian turned her head slowly and looked at him. The first time she had met his eyes since he found her on the kitchen floor. Her gaze was steady. Too steady. The composure of someone who had been rehearsing this moment. "Yes," she said. "I know what it means." Ernest waited. "You don't remember me," she said. "That's the worst part." The sentence landed like a blade between his ribs. He searched her face, the angular jaw, the hazel eyes, the dark hair pulled back tight, and the faint scar at her left temple that he had noticed months ago and never asked about. "Should I?" he asked. And he hated the question even as it left his mouth, because it confirmed exactly what she had said. "I was 13, she said. "You were, I don't know, young. You came to a warehouse on the waterfront. It wasn't the one they kept us in. It was the one next to it, the one with the office upstairs. You came to sign something, papers. I saw you through a gap in the wall. There was a hole in the drywall, about the size of a fist. I watched you sign papers at a desk, and then you left." Ernest's mouth went dry. "I didn't know what you were signing. I was 13. I didn't understand any of it, but I remembered your face. You were the only one who didn't look angry. You looked bored. That's what I remembered most. How bored you looked. Like it was nothing. Like we were nothing." "Lillian." "My name isn't Lillian." The room contracted around him. It's what I use now," she continued. "It's what I've used for years. But the name I had then, the name on whatever manifest you signed, was different. It doesn't matter. The point is, I was there. I was part of what moved through your network. I was 13 years old, and I was cargo." Ernest's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs to stop it, a gesture of control that suddenly felt obscene. "I got out," she said. "Not because of you. Not because of anyone in your world. I got out because the operation shut down, and they moved most of us to a different network, and at a transfer point in Portland, I ran. I was 15. I lived on the street for 2 years. Then I found a shelter. Then I found a program. Then I built a life." "Why are you here?" "In your house." "Yes." She looked at the tea he had brought her. She did not pick it up. "I spent 8 years healing. Therapy. Support groups. Medication. All of it. And it worked, mostly. I have a life. I have a degree. I have people who care about me. But there was one thing I couldn't let go of. Me. Not you specifically. The idea of you. The man who signed the papers. I didn't know your name then. It took me 3 years of research to find it. Public records, corporate filings, the overlap between Crown Industrial and the routes that the FBI later mapped. I'm not stupid, Ernest. I'm not a victim anymore. For I'm a woman who needed to understand. Understand what? Whether you knew, whether you cared, whether you lost any sleep." She paused. "Whether you were a monster or just a coward." The word landed, coward, not the worst thing he had been called, but the most accurate. "I took the job to see for myself," she said. "I've been watching you for 9 months. The way you treat people, the way you run things, the rules you have. No women, no children, no collateral. I've heard you say it. I've seen you enforce it. And I think you believe it. I think you believe you changed. And maybe you did. But changing doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase me." Ernest sat in the silence that followed. The clock in the foyer ticked. The rain eased to a steady murmur. He thought about what it would mean to say "I'm sorry," and understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical wound, that those words would be worse than useless. That they would be an insult, and that no apology could bridge the distance between a man who signed papers and a 13-year-old girl who watched through a hole in the wall. "No," he said. "It doesn't." The call came the next morning at 7. Ernest had not slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the night in his study, going through files he had kept locked in a floor safe for over a decade. Files he had told himself he kept for insurance, but which, he now understood, he had kept as evidence of his own guilt. Cataloged and preserved like a wound he was afraid to let heal. The phone displayed a number he had not seen in years. He answered it. Ernest, long time. The voice was smooth, unhurried, carrying the practiced warmth of a man who used friendliness as a weapon. Victor Phelan, FIA former associate, former logistics coordinator for the Pacific Corridor routes, former ghost. Victor, I heard you had some trouble at the house last night. Shame. That's a beautiful property. I've always admired it from the outside. Ernest said nothing. He let the silence do the work. In his world, the first person to speak after a provocation was the first to lose position. Victor continued. I also heard you have a guest. Interesting choice of staff, Ernest. Very interesting. A woman with that particular background working in your home. You'd think someone with your instincts would have run a deeper background check. What do you want, Victor? A meeting. Today. In neutral ground. There's a seafood place on Alki Beach. You know the one. I'll be there at noon. Come alone or don't come at all. But Ernest, you'll want to come. The line went dead. Ernest set the phone down and stared at the wall of his study. Above his desk hung a photograph of the Seattle skyline at dusk, taken from the water. He had purchased it at an auction 6 years ago because something about it appealed to him. The city gleaming with ambition, and the water dark and indifferent beneath it. Now it looked different. Now it looked like a place with things hidden under the surface. Victor Phelan. They had not spoken since Ernest shut down the corridor routes. Victor had been furious, not morally, but financially. The routes had been enormously profitable, and their closure had cost Victor's operation millions. He had disappeared shortly after, retreating into other ventures on the East Coast. Ernest had assumed, hoped, that Victor had faded permanently. Assumptions. The refuge of men who didn't want to look. He went to check on Lillian. She was in the guest bedroom now, door slightly ajar. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed in clothes that were not hers, a sweater and pants from the emergency supply Marcus kept in the security office. The bruises on her neck had darkened overnight. They looked worse in the gray morning light. Someone from my past called, Ernest said from the doorway. He did not enter the room. A man named Victor Phelan. Does that name mean anything to you? She looked up. Something moved behind her eyes. Not recognition, but alertness, the posture of an animal detecting a predator's scent. No, she said carefully. Should it? He was involved in the same operations I was. The same routes. He may be the person behind what happened to you last night. Why? Because you're proof, and you're a living witness to what those routes did. And I think he wants to use that proof, not to expose me, but to control me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what would he want you to do? I don't know yet. I'm meeting him at noon. Are you going to go? Yes. Then you should know something else. She stood, slowly, carefully, one hand braced against the bed frame. I wasn't the only one watching you. When I took this job, I didn't tell anyone. But about 3 months ago, someone contacted me. Anonymous message. They knew who I was. They knew I was in your house. They offered money, a lot of money, for information about your routines, your schedule, your security. I didn't respond. But they knew. Someone has been tracking me since before last night. The implications cascaded through Ernest's mind like dominoes. Lillian had come to his house for her own reasons, to observe, to understand, but someone else had found her. Someone else had recognized her value, not as a person, but as a piece in a game. A weapon. A pressure point. You should have told me, he said. I should have done a lot of things differently, so should you. He could not argue with that. At noon, he drove to Alki Beach alone. The restaurant was half empty on a Tuesday, which is why Victor had chosen it. The man sat at a corner table by the window, wearing a navy overcoat and an expression of practiced geniality. He was 53, lean, silver-haired, with the kind of face that could pass for a college dean or a senator. He had the hands of a man who never did his own work. Ernest sat across from him without greeting. I'll keep this simple, Victor said, pouring himself water from a glass carafe. The Pacific corridor is being reopened. Not by me alone. There's a consortium now. New money, new infrastructure, new markets. The routes are better than they were a decade ago. More secure. More profitable. And they need your port access. No. Victor smiled. I appreciate the directness. But let me give you some context before you close that door. He leaned forward. I know about the girl. I know she's been in your house for 9 months. I know who she was, and what she can testify to. I also know that if certain documents, let's call them logistics records, were to surface in the right hands, your entire legitimate empire would collapse. Crown Industrial, to the waterfront contracts, the political relationships you've spent a decade cultivating, all of it. You're threatening me. I'm presenting you with an opportunity. You provide port access, quietly, the way you used to. In exchange, the records stay buried, the girl stays safe, and your empire continues to grow. It's a transaction, Ernest. You've always been good at those. Ernest looked at Victor Phelan and saw, for the first time with total clarity, the thing he had spent 12 years pretending he was not. A man who had enabled monstrous things and then walked away clean while the people he had damaged continued to carry the weight. How many? Ernest asked. Victor blinked. How many what? How many people are you planning to move through those roads? That's not your concern. It was my concern 12 years ago. I just didn't ask the question. Victor's smile faded. Don't get righteous on me, Ernest. You don't have the standing for it. You're right, Ernest said. I don't. But here's what I have. The ability to say no, and the willingness to accept what that costs me. He stood. Victor's voice followed him, harder now, stripped of charm. Think about it. You have 72 hours. After that, the records go to the FBI. The girl's identity becomes public, and everything you've built turns to ash. Ernest walked out into the rain, and the next 3 days were the longest of Ernest Crown's life. Not because of fear, though fear was present, a steady undercurrent humming beneath everything, like a live wire under floorboards. Not because of strategy, though his mind worked ceaselessly, mapping scenarios, calculating outcomes, identifying leverage points. The days were long because, for the first time, he was sitting with something he could not fix, delegate, or buy his way out of. He was sitting with what he had done. In the evenings, after Marcus's security briefings and the encrypted calls to his attorneys, Ernest would find himself in the sitting room where Lillian had first told him the truth. She had moved to the guest bedroom, but each night she came downstairs. Not to seek his company, at least not at first. She came for the kitchen, she made tea, she sat at the counter and stared at the spot on the floor where she had been beaten. And there was something in the way she looked at it that Ernest recognized. The compulsive return to the scene of pain, the way a tongue keeps probing a broken tooth. The first night, he stayed in the doorway. She did not acknowledge him. The second night, she spoke. You don't sleep either, she said. It was not a question. No. What do you do all night? Think. About what? What you told me. What the note said. Whether it's possible to be guilty of something you convinced yourself you didn't do? She considered this. Yes, she said simply. That's exactly what guilt is. They did not speak further that night, but something shifted in the quality of the silence between them. It was no longer the silence of strangers or the silence of a man and the woman he had damaged. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of the same wound, looking down. The third night, she asked him a question that broke him. When you shut it down, the roots, the network, what did you do afterward? I restructured. Focused on the construction side. Built it into what it is now. Did you look for us? He did not answer for a long time. She waited. She had learned to wait in places far worse than this. No, he said finally. I didn't. Why? Because looking for you would have meant admitting you existed. And admitting you existed would have meant admitting what I was. What were you? The question hung in the air between them like something fragile and heavy at once. Complicit, he said. I was complicit. It was the first time he'd said the word out loud. He had thought it in the formless way one thinks things at 3 a.m. He had felt it, pressing against his chest, like a stone. But he had never given it voice. And hearing it, in his own voice, in this room, and in front of this woman, was like watching a load-bearing wall collapse. Something inside him shifted, and the structure of who he believed himself to be began to crack. She did not comfort him. She did not say it was okay, because it was not okay. She did not say she forgave him, because forgiveness was not something owed or earned in a single conversation. And she simply sat with him in the rubble of his confession, and let the silence do what silence does when it is shared between honest people. It held space for the truth. On the 4th morning, Marcus came to him with information. Victor Phelan's consortium is bigger than we thought, Marcus said, spreading a series of documents across the study desk. We've identified 6 partners. 3 are overseas, Cyprus, Singapore, Lagos. The other 3 are domestic. One of them is Alan Merrick. Ernest went still. Alan Merrick was a real estate developer with deep political connections, a man whose charitable donations and public persona were so polished they reflected light. He sat on the boards of 3 nonprofits, including one that provided housing for trafficking survivors. Merrick, Ernest said. The irony is not lost on me, Marcus replied flatly. He's been funneling money through his development projects. Shell companies embedded inside legitimate construction contracts. Same playbook he used to run, except he's better at hiding it. What about the records Victor mentioned? The ones he's threatening to release? They're real. I've confirmed it through our contacts. Victor has the original logistics manifests from the Pacific Corridor operations, the ones with your routing signatures. If those go public, it's not just reputation damage, it's criminal exposure. Ernest sat with this. The 72-hour deadline was approaching. In roughly 36 hours, Victor Phelan would either get what he wanted or burn Ernest's world to the ground. There's a third option, Marcus said carefully, which is, we eliminate Victor, quietly. It wouldn't be the first time a threat was neutralized. Ernest looked at Marcus. The suggestion was delivered without emotion, a professional assessment, and the kind Marcus had offered before, and Ernest had accepted before. He had ordered the neutralization of threats to his empire with the same dispassionate calculation that he used to review quarterly earnings. No, Ernest said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. If I kill Victor to protect myself from the consequences of what I did, I haven't changed at all. I'm just the same man with a different suit. Ernest, with respect, this is not the time for moral philosophy. With respect, Marcus, this is the only time. That evening, Lillian found him in the study. She stood in the doorway the way he had stood in hers, on the threshold, neither in nor out. The bruises on her neck had faded to a sickly yellow-green. She moved more freely now, though he noticed she still held her left arm close to her body, protecting the ribs beneath. Marcus told me about Merrick, she said. Ernest looked up from the documents spread across his desk. Marcus talks too much. Marcus is loyal to you. He thought I should know because my safety is part of the equation. She paused. He's right. I should know. What do you want to know? What you're planning to do? Ernest leaned back in his chair. For a moment, the mask of control slipped, and she saw him as he truly was. Not the mob boss, not the businessman, not the man who had signed papers 12 years ago. And she saw a man who was exhausted by the weight of decades of decisions that had seemed, at the time, like no decisions at all. I'm going to destroy the network, he said. Victor's consortium, Merrick's involvement, the new routes they're building, all of it. How? The records Victor is using to threaten me. They don't just implicate me. They implicate him. They implicate Merrick. They map an entire infrastructure if I release them. All of them. Yeah, including my own exposure. The network collapses. You'd expose yourself. Yes, you'd lose everything. Probably. You'd go to prison. Possibly. She stepped into the room. Her movements were deliberate, careful, the movements of a woman who had spent years learning to inhabit space rather than shrink from it. Why? She asked. Because Victor's right about one thing. I don't have the standing for righteousness, but I have the standing for consequences. I can accept what I did. I can make the cost of it real, not just for me, but for everyone who built that system. And me. What happens to me if those records go public? The question stopped him. He had been so focused on the strategic implications, the legal exposure, the collapse of his business, the federal investigation that would follow, that he had not fully considered what public exposure would mean for her, her identity, her past, the life she had built on top of years of trauma, in carefully constructed, deliberately private. Nothing happens to you without your consent, he said. If you don't want to be part of this, you won't be. I will not use your story as a weapon. I will not parade your pain for strategic advantage. You are not leverage. You are not a card to play. She was quiet for a long time. He could see her thinking, not the quick, tactical thinking he was accustomed to, but something deeper, slower, in the processing of someone who had learned to distrust every offer of safety. My name, she said finally, the one on the manifest. It was Haley. Haley Mathis. I was taken from a foster home in Spokane when I was 12. I was moved through 4 different locations over the course of a year before I ended up at the waterfront warehouse. I was number 847 in whatever system you used to track cargo. She paused. If you release those records, my number will be in them. My name might be recoverable, and I need to decide whether I can live with that. You don't have to decide tonight. I know, but I want you to understand something. She looked at him with the same steady gaze she had held since the first night, the gaze that did not flinch or soften. I did not come here for revenge. I came here to understand, and I do understand now. You were a coward. You looked away. You told yourself it wasn't your fault, and every year that you didn't face it, the lie got easier, and the truth got harder. Yes, but the fact that you're sitting here, at this desk, seriously considering destroying your own life to dismantle a network you once profited from, that tells me something too. What does it tell you? That it's possible to change, not easily, not cleanly, not in a way that erases what came before, but it's possible. She turned to leave. At the door, she paused. Release the records, she said. All of them, including mine. I survived the worst thing that ever happened to me. I can survive being known. She left the room. Ernest sat alone in the silence, and for the first time in 12 years, the silence did not feel like hiding. It felt like the moment before decision. The held breath before the fall. 40 hours. That was all Ernest had. He spent them dismantling himself with the same surgical precision he had once used to build an empire. The first call was to his attorney, David Yoon. David had been Ernest's legal counsel for a decade, a sharp, careful man who had navigated the gray areas of Ernest's business with the practiced neutrality of a man who believed that legality and morality were separate jurisdictions. I need to make a disclosure, Ernest said. A long pause. What kind of disclosure? The kind that ends my career, collapses several ongoing investigations, and probably puts me in front of a grand jury. Another pause, longer. I'm going to need you to be very specific. Ernest was specific. He laid out the Pacific Corridor operations, the routes, the manifests, the financial records, and his role in all of it. He explained Victor's threat. He explained the new consortium. He named Alan Merrick. He named every name he could remember, and when his memory failed, he referenced the files. When he was finished, David Yoon was quiet for a very long time. If you do this, David said, I cannot protect you. When we're talking about conspiracy charges, potentially RICO, the statute of limitations on some of this may have expired, but not all of it. And the civil exposure alone, I know. You would lose Crown Industrial. I know. You might lose your freedom. I know, David. Then why? Ernest thought about the question. He thought about a 13-year-old girl watching through a hole in the wall. And he thought about the word bored and how it had cut him more deeply than any accusation of cruelty ever could. Because the cost of not doing it is higher than anything they can take from me. The next call was to an FBI agent named Torres, a woman Ernest had met once, briefly, at a legitimate fundraiser, and who had been building cases against Pacific Corridor trafficking networks for 7 years. She answered on the second ring. Agent Torres, this is Ernest Crown. I have information about an active trafficking consortium operating through the Puget Sound port system, and I'd like to arrange a meeting. I should tell you up front that the information implicates me directly. The meeting was set for the following morning. That evening, Ernest did something he had not done in years. He sat in his kitchen, the same kitchen where Lillian had been found on the floor, and he cooked, nothing elaborate. Pasta, a simple sauce, and he moved through the motions with hands that were steadier than they should have been, given that he was likely cooking his last meal as a free man in his own home. Lillian came in while he was chopping garlic. She stood at the counter across from him and watched. "You're giving them everything," she said. "Yes." "You called the FBI." "Yes." "You know what happens next?" "More or less." She was quiet. Then she picked up a knife and began slicing tomatoes. They worked in silence, side by side, the rhythm of the kitchen filling the space between them with something that was not quite peace, but was closer to it than either of them had felt in a long time. "I have money set aside," Ernest said without looking up. "Clean money from legitimate investments that predate the corridor operations. It's in a trust that can't be seized. I've arranged for it to be directed to a foundation, specifically one that provides long-term support for trafficking survivors. David is setting up the structure now." "Ernest, it's not enough. I know it's not enough. Nothing will ever be enough, but it's something. And it's the only thing I have left to give that isn't tainted." She set down the knife. She turned to face him, in the warm light of the kitchen, the same amber light she always left burning above the stove. Her face held an expression he had never seen before. Not gratitude, not forgiveness, something more complex, something that looked like the beginning of something, though neither of them had the vocabulary for it yet. "You're not doing this for me," she said. It was half statement, half question. "I'm doing it because of you," he said. "But not for you, for me, because I need to be able to live in my own skin." She nodded. Slowly, as if this was the answer she had hoped for, the only honest answer. "Then I'll be there tomorrow," she said. "At the meeting, not as your asset, not as your evidence. As myself, as Haley." They ate dinner in the kitchen without speaking. The rain had stopped. For the first time in days, the silence between them felt like something they had chosen, rather than something that had been imposed. The meeting with Agent Torres took place in a windowless conference room at the FBI field office in downtown Seattle. Ernest arrived at 8 in the morning, flanked by David Yoon and carrying 2 bankers' boxes of files. The originals from his floor safe, plus digital copies on an encrypted drive. Torres was a small woman with sharp eyes and the posture of someone who had been lied to professionally for most of her career. She looked at the boxes, looked at Ernest, and said, "You understand that nothing you say in this room is off the record." "I do. And you understand that cooperation does not guarantee immunity." "I'm not asking for immunity. I'm asking you to use what I'm giving you to shut down an active trafficking operation before it restarts." Torres studied him. Then she opened the first box. The next 6 hours were the most methodical self-destruction Ernest had ever experienced. He walked Torres and her team through every document, every route, every signature. He identified the key players: Victor Phelan, Alan Merrick, the overseas partners. He provided financial records, communication logs, and the specific details of how the logistics had been structured to evade detection. He answered every question, including the ones that made David Yoon visibly uncomfortable. And you're telling me, Torres said at one point, leaning forward with her hands flat on the table, that you ran these routes for 3 years and never once directly confirmed what you were transporting. That's correct. Do you expect me to believe that? No. And I expect you to understand that willful ignorance was the entire point. The system was designed so that people like me could maintain deniability. We used coded language. We avoided direct contact. We structured the operation so that complicity didn't require explicit knowledge, just the decision not to ask questions. And you made that decision. Every day for 3 years, Torres sat back. Something in her expression shifted, not toward sympathy, but toward a grudging recognition of honesty. We'll need her testimony, Torres said. The woman you mentioned, the survivor. She'll speak to you on her own terms. She's not my property and she's not my witness. You negotiate with her directly, through her own legal counsel. Torres nodded. Haley came in at 2 in the afternoon. She had dressed simply, jeans, a dark sweater, her hair down for the first time Ernest had seen. She sat across from Torres with a composure that could have been mistaken for coldness, but was, Ernest understood, the armor of a woman who had survived by learning to occupy space without apologizing for it. She told her story. Not all of it. Some things were for her and her therapist alone, but enough. The warehouse, the transfers, the year of her life that had been stolen, the 15 years since that she had spent rebuilding. She spoke clearly, without tears, and though tears would not have diminished her. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed the truth so many times that it has become something they carry rather than something that carries them. Torres listened, wrote, asked careful questions. And when Haley was finished, Torres said, I believe you, and I'm going to use what you've given me. Victor Phelan was arrested that evening. Alan Merrick was arrested the following morning at his home in Medina, while his children were at school. The consortium's overseas partners were flagged through international channels. Within 72 hours of Ernest's disclosure, the Pacific Corridor reactivation was dead. Ernest was not arrested, not immediately. The prosecutors, armed with his cooperation and the mountain of evidence he had provided, made a calculation. His testimony was more valuable than his incarceration, at least in the short term. He was placed under federal supervision, travel restrictions, asset monitoring, regular check-ins. Crown Industrial was put into a structured dissolution, its legitimate contracts transferred to a successor company. Its employees offered placement assistance. The news broke on a Thursday. By Friday, Ernest Crown's name was on every local news outlet, several national ones, and a cascade of social media posts, ranging from outrage to grudging respect to accusations that his cooperation was a calculated move to avoid real punishment. They were not entirely wrong. Ernest knew that cooperation was strategic. Self-destruction, when managed well, could be its own form of control. But sitting in his study, soon to be someone else's study, he also knew that strategy alone did not explain the feeling in his chest. The feeling of something heavy being set down, not gone, not dissolved, but set down after years of carrying it, in a place where he could finally look at it directly. Haley came to see him on a Friday afternoon, 1 week after the arrests. She stood in the foyer of the mansion that was no longer quite his, wearing a coat he had not seen before. She looked different, not in any way he could pinpoint, but something had shifted. She stood taller, or perhaps she had always stood this tall, and he was only now seeing it. I'm leaving Seattle, she said. I have a friend in San Francisco. I'm going to stay with her for a while. That's good. I wanted to tell you in person. He nodded. They stood in the foyer, 6 feet apart, with the front door open behind her and the November light gray and clean. I don't forgive you, she said. I want you to know that. I know. Not because I'm angry. I'm not angry anymore, not at you specifically, But forgiveness implies that what happened can be resolved. Yeah, and it can't. Not between us. It's too big, and it happened too long ago, and too much of my life was shaped by it. I understand. But I want you to know something else. She stepped forward just slightly, closing the distance between them by inches. What you did this week, the disclosure, the FBI, the foundation, it doesn't erase anything, but it matters. Not because it helps me. It matters because somewhere, right now, there are people being moved through routes just like the ones you used to run. And some of those routes are now closed because you decided to stop pretending. I should have done it 12 years ago. Yes, you should have. But you did it now. And that's what I'll remember. She held out her hand. He looked at it. This small, deliberate gesture, offered not in warmth but in something harder and more valuable, acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that two people who were connected by the worst of circumstances could, with enough honesty, find something that was not reconciliation, but was not nothing either. He took her hand. Her grip was firm. She held it for exactly 2 seconds, then let go. Goodbye, Ernest. Goodbye, Haley. She walked out the front door. He watched her go down the stone steps and along the path to the gate, where a car was waiting. She did not look back. She did not need to. And Ernest closed the door. The house was quiet. The kitchen light was off. He stood in the foyer of the home he was about to lose, in the city that would soon know him for what he had been, and he breathed. Not the shallow breath of a man in hiding. Not the controlled breath of a man performing power, but the full, unguarded breath of a man who had finally stopped pretending. Outside, the rain began again. Seattle rain, persistent, patient, indifferent. It washed the streets and the rooftops and the waterfront warehouses, some of which still stood empty now, their purposes buried in files that were, at this moment, being reviewed by federal agents in a windowless room. The city did not forgive. The city did not forget. The city simply continued, brick by brick, tide by tide, life by life, building itself on top of everything it had been. Ernest Crown was no longer the man he had been. He was not yet the man he might become. He was standing in the space between uncomfortable, unfinished, and for the first time in his life, honest. It was not redemption. Redemption implied an ending, a balance restored. There was no balance to be found in what he had done. There was only the going forward, carrying the weight openly, letting it be seen. It was the beginning of something that did not yet have a name, but it was his, and he did not look away.